Just listen to those words for a second. Those are the desperate final words of a leader, broadcast over the radio as Soviet tanks were rolling through the streets of Budapest to crush a revolution. It's a single, heartbreaking moment that really captures the human cost of this new global conflict that was about to define an entire century.
You see, the tragedy in Hungary wasn't just some random event. It was a brutal symptom of a much, much bigger struggle. This is the story of how the incredible alliance that defeated fascism in World War II completely fell apart, and how it plunged the world not into another firestorm of open combat, but into a tense, ideological standoff we now call the Cold War.
And that brings us to a really fundamental question, one that echoes throughout history. How does winning one war so often plant the seeds for the next one? How did that absolute triumph in 1945 lead not to some lasting peace, but to a world that was more dangerously divided than ever before? So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at how that wartime alliance just crumbled into dust. Then, we'll see how a new line was literally drawn across the map of Europe. After that, we'll dive into the first huge confrontation in Berlin. And finally, we'll explore how this rivalry created the armed and divided world that so many of us grew up in.
All right, let's jump right into the beginning. The smoke from World War II has barely even cleared, and you can already see the so-called allies starting to drift apart. I mean, how did it all go wrong so fast?
Well, when you boil it all down, the conflict really came from a massive disagreement on what the world should look like. On one side, you have the United States and Great Britain. They wanted a post-war world with self-determination, free elections, you know the deal. But for the Soviet Union, who'd been invaded from the West not once, but twice, security was everything. Stalin was absolutely determined to build a buffer zone of friendly governments on his western border. These two worldviews just could not coexist.
And to create that buffer zone, the Soviet army, which, remember, had just liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, well, they just stayed put. And one by one, they set up pro-Soviet governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. These weren't officially colonies. The term they used was satellite states. Basically, countries that were independent in name only, but whose orbits were completely controlled by Moscow.
The West is watching all this happen with just a growing sense of dread. Then, in 1946, Winston Churchill comes to America and gives a speech that gives this whole division a name. He declared that from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic Sea, an iron curtain had descended across Europe. For a lot of people, that moment, those words were the official start of the Cold War. Stalin's response, oh, it was immediate, and it was furious. He shot back, accusing Churchill of being a warmonger, of pushing a racist idea to justify English-speaking dominance. And just like that, the war of words was on. Any trust that held that old alliance together was totally gone, replaced by pure suspicion and hostility. So, with the insults flying back and forth, it didn't take long for this war of words to turn into actual government policy. This is the moment where fear starts to meet strategy, and that line in Europe gets drawn in permanent ink. The first real test case was Greece. There was a nasty civil war going on between communist rebels and the monarchy. Now, Great Britain had been propping up the anti-communists, but Britain was totally broke from the war. They announced they were pulling their aid. This created a huge power vacuum, and the United States was terrified the Soviets were going to jump right in. So America responds with this incredible 1-2 punch of a strategy. First, there's the Truman Doctrine, which basically says we'll give money and weapons to any country fighting communism. But their real genius move was the Marshall Plan. This was a massive economic recovery program. The thinking behind it was just brilliant. A strong, prosperous Europe wouldn't be tempted by communism. It wasn't charity, it was a strategic investment in a capitalist future. If you want to understand the American mindset at the time, this quote from Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson just says it all. He compared it to a barrel of apples. One rotten apple could spoil the whole thing. The fear was that if just one country fell to communism, it would trigger a chain reaction. This idea became known as the domino theory. And believe me, it would drive U.S. foreign policy for decades.
And the scale of this Marshall Plan, wow. $13 billion. Now, that might not sound like a crazy number today, but back then, it was an absolutely staggering amount of money. In today's dollars, we're talking way over $150 billion. This was a massive investment to create stable, prosperous allies who would stand with the West.
So, what's the big idea connecting both the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan? It all comes down to one powerful word: containment.
This policy, first really laid out by diplomat George Kennan, said the goal wasn't to roll back communism or destroy the Soviet Union. No, the goal was to contain it, to keep it within its existing borders and stop it from spreading 1 inch further. All right, so the US has this big new policy of containment. But a policy is just words on a page until it gets tested, right? Well, the first huge, dangerous, direct challenge was about to happen. And the flashpoint? The divided city of Berlin, located deep, deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. Here's the setup. After the war, both Germany and the city of Berlin were carved up into 4 occupation zones. Well, the US, Britain, and France decided to merge their 3 zones to create a new, independent West German state. To Stalin, this looked like a direct threat, a unified capitalist enemy right on his doorstep. And his response was absolutely brutal. He decided to cut off West Berlin from the world. He blockaded every road, every rail line, every canal, trying to starve 2.5 million people into surrender. The world held its breath, thinking World War III was about to start. But the Allies responded not with an army, but with an incredibly audacious plan, the Berlin airlift. I want you to try and picture this. For more than 10 months, American and British planes flew nonstop, around the clock, delivering 2.3 million tons of food, coal, medicine, everything. At its peak, a plane was landing in West Berlin every few minutes. It was a logistical miracle, and it was a massive political victory. In May of 1949, the Soviets finally gave up and lifted the blockade. The Berlin crisis may not have started a hot war, but it absolutely cemented the division of Europe. The lines were now drawn in concrete. And this next phase of the Cold War is where these informal divisions harden into formal military alliances, all backed by terrifying new weapons. So in 1949, the Western nations form a team. It's called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a defensive pact where everyone promised that an attack on one member was an attack on all of them. Naturally, the Soviet Union responded by creating its own team in 1955, the Warsaw Pact, which formalized its military control over all of Eastern Europe. The continent was now split into 2 heavily armed camps. And this military standoff gets supercharged by an insane arms race. In 1949, America's monopoly on the atomic bomb ends when the Soviets test their own. And that just kicks off this terrifying technological spiral. From A-bombs to the way, way more powerful hydrogen bomb, and then finally to intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs that could deliver nuclear warheads to any city on Earth in a matter of minutes. So you have to ask, with all these planet-killing weapons, how did the world not blow itself up? Well, the answer is a pretty grim strategy called deterrence. The logic is kind of crazy, but it goes like this. Because both the US and the Soviet Union had enough nukes to completely annihilate each other, neither side would ever be crazy enough to start a war. It was this fragile, terrifying peace built on a promise of mutually assured destruction. And if you need one single physical symbol of this whole divided, fearful world, look no further than the Berlin Wall. Built pretty much overnight in 1961 to stop East Germans from escaping to the West, this scar of concrete and barbed wire became the real-life manifestation of Churchill's Iron Curtain, a brutal, ugly monument to a world torn in two. And all of this leaves us with a really deep and unsettling question. Sure, deterrence might have prevented an all-out nuclear war between the superpowers, but can you really call it peace when the entire world is living under a constant nuclear threat and smaller, brutal proxy wars are being fought all over the globe? That, right there, is the central nagging paradox that defined an entire era.